Well, back to the report that came out from the Global Carbon Project that indicates that in 2019, rather than reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, they've grown slightly to a total of 36.8 billion tons. And what bothers me, Michael, is that as much as Trump is a disgrace and a danger to humanity and to this country, of course, and the world, he's really a shill. He's really a useful idiot for the fossil fuel companies. They get a free ride. Everybody's angry at Trump for many reasons, but people concerned about the environment and global warming are certainly angry at him because he's the leading denier and he's the one that's holding up and he pulled us out of the Paris Accords, etc. But the people who are really profiting from Trump are the oil companies, and they get to advertise on television to say, oh, what a great job they're doing with alternative energy and making energy out of algae and all this phony greenwashing stuff where they're talking about stuff that's not real, but it's aspirational. And meanwhile, their corporate bottom line is what they have in the ground, the reserves. That is how their companies are valued. So if they take just 1/5 of what they have out of the ground, it'll be the end of the world. So there's the reality. How do you get that reality and get people to stop being conned by the idea that in the future there are alternative energy? We don't have a future. The alternative energies that we have are in the present. But as long as they keep saying it's in the future, we won't have a future.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think one value in my book and in the argument I'm trying to present is to look at climate change as a threat to national security, the way we view terrorism, for example, or the threat of nuclear war. It is. Climate change is an implacable foe. It's threatening our shores, our farms, our forests. It's a national security threat. And under those circumstances, I think it's the patriotic requirement of the nation to rally together to resist this threat, which is going to punish all of us if we do not do that. And those who continue to resist such efforts, to continue to promote fossil fuels under these circumstances, are standing in the way of protecting the nation. I think that's the kind of requirement, the kind of argument that will be required to make progress. I mean, we're going to have to rally the nation, Republicans as well as Democrats, if we're to succeed in this. It can't be done by Democrats alone. So I think a national security argument is the way that we can shame those who insist on continuing to produce fossil fuels.
And you've made the case, Michael, that global warming and its impact on the United States is a major national security issue, and it should be made a national security issue, and it's a way to unite Democrats and Republicans, deniers and alarmists alike. And the Pentagon do understand that climate change will, in time, supersede all other threats to national security. But it also will supersede all threats in terms of global security. So how do you bridge that? In other words, it's not just about national security the way we see it in terms of the Pentagon defending the United States against enemies abroad. The enemy is among us, and it's across borders. And to my mind, there is actually a silver lining in these dark clouds on the horizon, in as much as we're all in lifeboat Earth together. Is it possible that we can unite around a common threat of global warming, ocean rise, and all of the catastrophes that accompany it with countries like Iraq? I mean, my God, look how much Iraq has been a disaster for the United States and, more importantly, for the Iraqi people. Most of that country will be underwater, within 20 years.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I think, again, the U.S. military provides us with a positive answer to that, Ian, because they see climate change as a source of global chaos and instability, something which they feel will bear on them, because they feel they'll be called out to deal with the consequences as the world's 911. Because of that, they believe that they have an obligation to reduce the risks and the consequences of climate change, both by taking steps institutionally to reduce their contributions to global warming by converting from fossil fuels to renewables internally, institutionally, but also by working with the militaries of other countries to do the same, to adapt to a climate change era. And it is official Pentagon policy to collaborate with the militaries of other countries to adapt to renewable energy and so on. So this is their policy. I wish governments could do that in Madrid, as they're meeting now, to follow the very same policy of cooperating across international boundaries in taking steps to move away from reliance on fossil fuels and to increase reliance on renewables. This is the way we must go.
And again, I'm speaking with Michael Clare, the Five College Professor of Peace and World Security Studies and Director of the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. His latest book just out is All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. And as you mentioned, Michael, the Pentagon itself is taking major steps to reduce its carbon emissions and doesn't want to be dependent upon oil and fossil fuels, particularly, for example, when I just mentioned, between 20 and 40 years, maybe 40 years from now, Iraq will be underwater. And Saudi Arabia, I think, could well be affected as well. So the real challenge is how do you, going back to the oil companies themselves, whose stock value depends upon their reserves, which are in the ground, which they simply can't extract unless they destroy the planet. So is there any way to globally devalue that? In other words, Russia doesn't have an economy beyond oil and gas and selling arms. So their future, if we ban oil and gas, which we should do it tomorrow, if not today. What happens? Saudi Arabia at least is understanding that it's going to be an orphaned country in terms of its major resource. That's why they've been trying to get nuclear reactors from Russia, which Trump was going to sell them under the table.
Yes. Well, the answer to that is either these companies themselves will adapt, and some of the European oil companies like Royal Dutch Shell and BP are beginning to say to themselves and to their stockholders, we see that the day of carbon, the era of carbon is coming to an end, and therefore we have to invest in other forms of energy. And as energy companies, we will transition from fossil fuels to renewables. We will invest in the new technology, so we will still be an energy company later in the century. It just won't be producing fossil fuels. That's one response. Unfortunately, the American corporations, especially ExxonMobil, the biggest, are resisting that move. They are trying to use their political clout, their political donations, their alliances with politicians to resist moves to make the transition, and that's why they have to be opposed politically as best as possible. But in other places like Russia you mentioned, I think it's very clear to younger Russians, to the millennial generation of Russians, that economy, that business plan of relying so much on fossil fuels is doomed, and that the country is doomed, and therefore you have to have a reform movement in Russia that essentially will replace the Putin model of fossil fuelization and replace it with a more modern economy that's based on other technologies. And, that is what the reform movement in Russia is saying. That's why Putin is so opposed to it. But I think it's clear that in time that reform movement will prevail, because it's the only hope for the younger generation of Russians.
So just in closing, Michael, our audience is largely a liberal, progressive audience that's pretty suspicious of the Pentagon. So I know your book is not about the military or militarizing efforts to deal with climate change. It's quite the opposite. It's a book about how the military is actually one of the last reality-based organizations in this country, since we are so divided between the reality-based community and the kind of Fox News alternative facts community, and that this is a way to bridge the gap and get people in this country all on board the dire necessity to deal with climate change. So give us your explanation to our audience as to why they should get your book and not think of it in terms of anything to do with the military, but really about the biggest threat that we all face in this country and around the world.
Okay, so that's a very fair question, Ian. And there are two. First of all, I think people should get the book because they'll learn a lot about something they didn't know, which is how the U.S. Department of Defense perceives climate change as a problem. And I think they'll discover a lot about climate change and the threat it poses that they didn't know, because, as I said earlier, the U.S. military has unique insights on the problem that are worth all of us knowing about. That's half of it. But I also think that people who are liberal and progressive should get the book and send copies to relatives and friends who are of the opposite position, to tell them to read it, because that's the way we're going to change opinion. Because, as you said, the military are not part of the liberal progressive community. They're one institution that stands independent from the partisan divide on climate change. And so I think their opinion counts, has a unique value in this debate, and perhaps can change some people's point of view on the issue that wouldn't necessarily listen to an environmental activist.
Well, Michael Clare, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Ian. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. And again, I've been speaking with Michael Clare, the Five College Professor of Peace and World Security Studies and Director of the Five College Program on Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. His books include Blood and Oil, The Race for What's Left, The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. And his latest book, just out, is All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. This program is available at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can bookmark it, sign up for email updates, as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy this program, make sure you rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and SoundCloud. And be sure to share the program with friends, family, and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media. And if you are in a position to support us so that we can sustain and build this program, visit us at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. Your support will help spread the word and keep us corporate-free, fearless, and independent. And we'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing. Bye for now.